our government's development partners in obtaining funding that is geared towards climate resilience and disaster risk reduction measures. We also have undertaken a vulnerability assessment of our entire road network in both the two islands of Samoa, Upolu and Savaii. Now, from this vulnerability assessment, we have in place a climate resilient road strategy which prioritizes which section or key roads or bridges that LTA need to prioritize in terms of rebuilding or building back to a climate resilient standards. Third, LTA have ensured that our designs for our roads and our bridges and all our land transport infrastructure have taken into account climate resilience. In terms of capacity, human resource capacity, it is a unique challenge to Samoa, given that Samoa doesn't have a university, or used to have didn't have a university that would offer a Bachelor of Engineering program. So all of us engineers here in Samoa have had to travel to Fiji, Australia or New Zealand to obtain a Bachelor of Engineering degree. Now, LTA has been at the forefront in collaborating with the University of South Pacific, which they also have a branch here in Samoa, to offer the Bachelor of Engineering program in Samoa. I thank you for the opportunity to speak and look forward to seeing the outcomes of this event. Whaatai.
So it was important to hear from somebody who's, not necessarily in the G20 circle. And G20 is the largest economies, but when you start thinking about vulnerability, when you start thinking about where infrastructure is being built, when you start to understand the highest amounts of risks, it's often in small island development states. And for TT to be able to articulate that risk and how that's translating into the policy in Samoa was helpful for us to hear. We have a really respected panel here. It's unfortunate that I have not managed time very well, but I do hope that we get a chance to listen to all of them, because we will then go into the deliberations with just different perspectives that we'll all be reacting to in the room there. Very quickly, I have Charlotte Bensil. Charlotte is the unit head disaster risk management at the Asian Development Bank. She has over 30 years of experience working on economic and financial aspects of disaster risk management in developing countries. Welcome, Charlotte. We have Rita Misal, who is the Global Recovery Advisor for UNDP. It's UNDP's Crisis Bureau, based in New York office. Rita is a post-disaster recovery practitioner with over 20 years of experience in the field of disaster recovery. Welcome. We have Professor Nishikawa, who joined the Japanese government service in 1982 and has held various positions in the UN, government of Tokyo, the Japanese government itself, and international organizations. In 1992, he took the position of Senior Disaster Relief Coordination Officer at UNDHA, where he coordinated international assistance to numerous disaster-stricken countries. And we have Sarabjit here. Sarabjit leads the EU's bilateral cooperation with India in the Directorate General for International Partnerships at the European Commission. Welcome to all of you. You're going to bring different perspectives, so I think that was really important for, I wanted to bring different perspectives here to share with the group. I'm going to start first with Professor Nishikawa. Professor Nishikawa, you've been doing this work, disaster risk reduction, for a long time. You've seen earthquakes, suddenly there's a peak in action, goes down. You've seen tsunamis. You've seen a lot of things in this field. And we heard politicians, or there's a momentum immediately after disaster, and it slowly fades away and then it comes back. So how do you build a case for resilience that ties in with the current concerns of policymakers? who's thinking about climate change maybe, or rising inequality, or energy crisis, or food security. Your views on that.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'd like to emphasize that, well, the elected officials tend to think about their term. In other words, some think that disasters will not happen during their term. I say this as a not in my term syndrome. And we have to break that illusion. And for the elected officials, their concern is to be elected again. And if the public at large, and especially the mass media, places importance on disaster reduction and sustainability and resilience, there would be more, I would say, awareness among the elected officials or the policymakers. And we have to mobilize such power. I would say that the ultimate solution to disaster risk reduction is to foster the culture of prevention. Also, I would like to emphasize that there are so many, I would say, billions of civil engineers, architects working around every corner of the globe. And they are the ones who really do the work for disaster resilience. And our discussions have to be reached toward their daily work. We discuss this mainly in English, but it has to be transformed into their own languages to be really practiced at every corner of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nishikawa. Short and sweet, but really important, not in my term. I mean, all of you are, or most of you are government bureaucrats. I think you understand what that mentality is. And how do you start to bring a culture of prevention? I think those are really high, important points. I'm starting to lose my questions. That's not being very adaptive or of me, but I found them. Sib, thank you, first of all, for joining at the last minute. So we had, when you talk about infrastructure and services, we had a distinguished gentleman flying from Australia to join the panel. Of course, his flight got cancelled. Service was not provided, and we had to adapt. And Sib and Rita were very generous in accepting to join the stage at the last minute. Sib, you're coming from having worked in the private sector before you joined EU. So I'd like you to bring in a little bit of the financing side. So my question to you really is, finance is a big question here. And how are governments creating a supporting investment environment to encourage private investment in resilient infrastructure? The SG also mentioned the importance of private financing. So
absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you, Amit, and it's always a pleasure. I mean, disaster resilience has become such a visible part of the EU-India relationship now, and that's great to see. So I'm always happy to keep supporting that. Look, I think yesterday, firstly, we were already talking about more globally, and for the G20, the parallels, or at least the synergies that we need to have between the working groups, and of course, this issue about supporting investment environments is indeed one of the topics of Working Group 3, right? So certainly when we're thinking ahead about synergies between these groups, it's certainly one of them. This is going to be one of the 4 topics that they're looking at there. I mean, look, private sector, I used to work in equity trading. Honestly, that was a lot easier than working in development financing, quite frankly. Probably because behind closed doors, nobody really sees what you're doing. So anyway, we won't talk about that. But from the EU's perspective, I mean, honestly, I'll try and be brief. There's a lot one could say about what we do here. I mean, first of all, we now have this global gateway strategy, which is a lot about resilient infrastructure, focusing on transport, energy, digital, key sectors we've already been talking about, we heard about today, which is about mobilizing 300 billion euros of investment in these sectors globally. That's as much about the hard infrastructure, the hard part, as it is about the soft part. And the soft part is, I guess, what we've done a lot of, I think, in more recent times we've done a lot of that, but I guess now we have more of a balance. So the hard part, the way I see it is, that's about innovative finance, right? So that's about de-risking using blended finance, which is what we've been doing already for quite a while. We now have the European Fund for Structural Development, which started off in Africa, which is now being extended globally. So that allows us to use guarantees, so first loss mechanisms. So we're talking about crowding in the private sector essentially, right? Sovereign loans, sub-sovereign loans, working with the banks a lot more. And I think Sarojana was talking about risk earlier on and about allowing companies to fail, basically, to test and fail if needed, which is basically, it's the same approach that pharmaceutical companies have. I used to work in the IP sector. It takes thousands of tests to get to the product that you eventually will use in the market. So this mentality of social goods and allowing testing to happen and failing so that we come up with solutions, I think it's really important. I won't go too much into how there's so many projects that we have, but we work with ADB right now. There's a huge infrastructure pipeline project, the Green Catalytic Facility. Catalytic, basically, using de-risking vehicles, bringing private capital, supporting green bonds, for example. So we're finally happy to be part of that. Bringing in our concessional, grants and financing, which I think is about 46 million, 50 million in this case. In India, working with AFD, our French partners in Chandigarh, on that water supply, 24/7 water supply project. So again, EIB doing metros. A lot of examples that we can give on the kind of the hard financing part. Very quickly on the soft part, though, I think the soft part is really multifaceted because you could be talking about predictability, interoperability. We talked about yesterday quite a lot. The EU taxonomy, which has been developed, I think is a good representation of that. We're talking about fiscal policies, public financial management, which we've worked a lot with the IMF, for example, and PIFA. We're also talking about skills, right? We're talking about education, entrepreneurial education, talking about research. I referred to earlier on the pharmaceutical sector, but we have a huge research program, Horizon Europe, which I think has got a lot of attention with Brexit, a lot of discussions on that recently. Horizon Europe is huge. But we're talking about helping the development of clean, innovative technologies, which is a part of this, this landscape, basically. And that landscape also, we're talking about standards, the G20 principles on quality infrastructure, which is essentially also about climate diplomacy. We're talking about ensuring that we have these issues represented, and that we're developing these standards in a multilateral way, which we then take around to others and say, look, this is what works, So that's important. The last thing I want to flag is sustainable finance, because that is where we're working a lot more, including in India as well. A lot of private banks that, you talk about developing green infrastructure pipelines. They don't understand necessarily what green finance is. So that landscape is huge and diverse. And so, we're talking about greening finance and financing green. Right, so helping banks to basically develop climate finance strategies. That's one part of the work. Advisory services, which is what we're actually doing now with IFC, the private sector arm of the World Bank in India, like India Green Finance Project. So that's something that we're really, supportive of, because helping them build pipelines is one thing, but helping them understand how to do that. For example, how do you structure PPP transactions? These kinds of things. These are the real nitty-gritty of how you get to developing green pipelines. And also the knowledge networks, building awareness of what types of products are out there, how we can actually achieve these things. Because India, I don't think people understand that sometimes. It's the second biggest green bond market in emerging markets, right? And it issued its first sovereign green bond this year, $1 billion green bond, and the use of proceeds will go to clean transport, climate change adaptation. So, the space is interesting. It's developing. We're happy to be part of it. It's great. So I think that's more or less how I kind of break it down, right, in terms of the hard part and the soft part, a little bit, just to capture a little bit about what we've been doing.
Thanks so much, Sib. I think, this is a really rich discussion, and rightly pointed out, some of this is also overlapping with not only the other working group, but also the next priority that we'll also be talking about. But the emphasis on both hard and soft, the instruments of financing that you need to create, but also the policy, the training, all of the other soft side. I think that's a good way to also start approaching, even for this working group, how do we look at the products we may want to come out with? Is it the soft side or the hard side? And I suspect the hard side may be covered by infrastructure working group or the sustainable finance working group, right? So,
can I just add one last thing very, very quickly? I think one thing I've noticed as well is, because we talked about short-termism just now, and it's not just a short-termism in terms of political cycles, it's also the short-termism in financial markets, in investors, right? That's huge. And investor expectations is one thing. Sometimes I think, sometimes we talk in these NDB conferences about risk and the risk that private sector perceives. And sometimes it is perception. It's a perception issue, not necessarily a real issue, which is, I think, maybe one thing that we could be looking at in the context of this working group, right? What are those perceptions issues? Because that can be about evidence, awareness raising, and maybe some of that, is changing within this new generation, which is a lot more eco-friendly, ESG focused. Maybe we're seeing a change in that respect as well.
Thank you for highlighting that. I think this thing about risk perception is actually quite important. I remember in the US, I was working along, they had a program called the brownfield renovation. And a lot of the industrial sites in the US were sitting unutilized or undeveloped because the financiers assumed that these were dirty in terms of contaminated. So there was no money going into these sites. And the US government had come out with a brownfields program, which was looking to understand whether the site was actually contaminated or not. And that information provided an impetus for development, because a lot of the sites were actually not contaminated. So, this understanding of risk, this perception of risk, not bringing in, financiers not going in because they're perceiving the risks to be high, is an important one. We'll turn to you, Charlotte. So, we're sitting in a G20 forum, and I'd like to come back to the G20 conversation. What steps can G20 take to remove or circumvent constraints that have so far dissuaded investors from putting up the volumes of investments required? And then what measures can we take to encourage infrastructure finance to consider the life cycle cost of infrastructure rather than just the upfront cost when analyzing cost benefits of the investments?
Thank you very much for that question. I think there's a lot that G20 can do, both to help remove constraints and incentivize investments in disaster resilience. In doing so, both to encourage private but also public sector investments. And I think it's important we talk about the two of them together. A lot of the investments that need to happen in resilient infrastructure do actually need to happen in the public sector. And the messages, the changes that need to happen are common in many cases to both. We need to remember particularly that those investments in standalone disaster resilience, for instance in integrated flood risk management projects, are generally speaking not bankable projects. They will require public investment. So I'm going to run quickly through 8 points I'd like to raise. Many of these are really picking up on what we've already heard this morning, particularly or including from SRSG's excellent intervention at the beginning. So apologies if I'm repeating things you've already heard, but they are some very important points. So really beginning with data. We're now we have the capability to model risk, to measure risk, to map risk, and we need to ensure that that information is made available to everyone who needs it in formats that they can use that apply to their particular context, the problems, the infrastructure they're building, and that they build that data in at the very beginning at initial project concept design. This is not a sort of safeguards issue that you think about 3/4 of the way into project design. We have to take resilient infrastructure in as a core aspect of design from the very beginning. The G20 needs to encourage area-wide climate and disaster risk assessments. It's not sufficient to look at individual items of infrastructure in isolation. We all understand a lot more now about systemic risk, about cascading risks. if, for instance, you invest in a disaster-resilient energy utility, but the water utility that you're reliant on is not disaster resilient, then you still have a problem. And we need to unpack and understand more fully how things interconnect. And again, to build that into early planning, to really understand that interconnectivity. The G20 can do a lot, of course, to promote disaster-sensitive codes and standards, including to ensure that countries aren't adopting blanket-wide standards, but ones that recognise differences in localised risk within countries, so that we're not overbuilding, that we can keep a lid on costs to the extent possible. The G20 can put across that message that resilient infrastructure isn't necessarily more costly, even at the very initial construction phase. I think there's sometimes a perception that it's going to add 20%, 30% to construction costs. That's not the case. It's often 2-3%, or just redesigning in a very different way and coming up with cheaper solutions. So we need to get those examples across as well of alternative ways of doing things. SRSG mentioned the excellent 2019 World Bank report on lifeline infrastructure. That included, for instance, an example of bridge designs, suggesting an idea where the deck of a bridge is encased in stainless steel. That not only builds resilience in that example, it reduces the initial construction cost, it reduces the maintenance cost, and extends the design life of that bridge. We need to get these examples out there, we need to build on them, and of course we heard about nature-based solutions just a moment ago and how they can be 25% cheaper. So we need to convey the message. We're not necessarily asking for much greater investment. We're talking about doing things differently, and the G20 can really promote that high-level message. Coming to this notion of short-termism, we need to encourage, the G20 needs to encourage the use of lower discount rates in cost-benefit analysis. So that is putting greater weight on benefits that ensue in the future. We all know that investments in resilience might not yield returns in terms of avoided losses next year, but they might do so in 25, 30 years. And we need to attribute sufficient weight to those benefits that flow potentially towards the end of the life of infrastructure. On cost-benefit analysis itself, we need far more evidence. You know, we hear these rules of thumb: $1 in $4, $1 saves $4, $1 saves $7 are the two most popular ones we hear. But these are based on very few examples, and it's often slightly nonsensical to convert those examples into averages. You know, I've seen examples which are based on some average of investment in a hydromet agency, in raising the height of village wells to provide protection against floodwaters, a few other miscellaneous things all thrown together and an average pops out. We are talking about very different hazardscapes, we're talking about very different sectors. We need to build that body of evidence, and the G20 can help encourage and promote that so that we can talk more specifically about individual sectors. And I do urge you, when you are using those numbers, to go into what you're citing and look at what sectors specifically those figures, those averages are based on, and just make sure you are pointing that out yourself rather than just happily jumping onto some of these numbers. And then finally, I just want to mention, of course, as we heard about from Suranjana, the importance that the G20 really needs to encourage inclusive efforts to build resilience, ensuring that we're using resources to the best possible effect. I'll end there. Thank you.
I don't have comments after that. That was perfect, brilliant. Thank you so much for that. And I think that helps us as we go into the next discussion as well. Rita, you've been spending a lot of time around the world in post-disaster situations. You know, I think we just heard from you on day before yesterday as well. And we do recognize that post-disaster recovery is often plagued by significant time gaps. Lack of continuous engagement, attention, declining resource commitments, etc. We talk also about building back better, right? So based on the experiences that you're seeing, what measures should be considered to make building back better and faster a key priority when assessing a way forward post a disaster?
Thank you so much. Thanks, Amit, for bringing up this question. First of all, I think I would like to say a little bit about Build Back Better. We've been using this term Build Back Better, Build Back Safer, Build Forward Better, Build, what is that we heard right now? So many. Out of that, probably my favorite is Build Back Better and Greener. If we have to use something, then that would be my favorite, I would say. Faster is not a notion when it comes to recovery, not necessarily best. For me, recovery is a marathon and not a sprint. You don't run with recovery. You have to plan a very deliberate plan, prepare for it, train for it before you can do good recovery processes. So if you're expecting your outcomes to be good, you might as well, invest before a crisis to do. So for me, I think when we talk about recovery, this notion of faster can be only relative to the magnitude of the crisis or the impact of the disaster on the community and relative to the capacities that exist in that particular community and the country as a whole. So that's an important point that I wanted to make before I get into a little bit more detail. The second thing that I wanted to, mention about this is, what is the kind of recovery we are talking about? How do we prioritize what to recover first? And this was kind of discussed a little bit between the panelists before about what is the infrastructure for, who it is for, right? So in terms of doing recovery, I think prioritizing or making a balance between what we seem to think as what will fuel economic growth vis-a-vis what will serve people to recover better is something that we should think through a lot much more, deeply into it. So that's the prioritizing or balancing out, economic growth or quick economic growth vis-a-vis what helps people to actually grow themselves, to recover themselves. That's the second point I would like to make. The third point that I would like to, mention here is that what is the equivalent we have of the National Disaster Response Force for recovery? Why haven't we thought about that? We have capacities spread all over. Someone just mentioned about engineers everywhere, a huge pool of architects and engineers. I think you mentioned that right now, right? Do we have any sort of, whether it is masons or engineers or academicians or NGOs or even, community-based organizations, any sort of arrangement whatsoever to understand what they can do in recovery and how do we prepare them for it? So we do not have that. We have invested a lot in response for good reasons, but we know, Madam SRSG mentioned that we're going to have 560 climate disasters a year. Not everything can be prevented. And so if we have to plan and organize recovery, where's the equivalent capacities we are putting in place for recovery? So that's the third point I want to make. And finally, I just want to, talk about global standards for resilient infrastructure. This understanding of the global standards and adapted to context, as SRSG mentioned also, is critical. And then this flow from grey into green infrastructure, this understanding, and I'm glad you brought this about, and the point about trying to quantify the co-benefits of investing in green infrastructure, which is not understood, But that's where communities bring in much more value rather than, very high-level professional or high technical skilled people. So that's something that I want to talk about. So in essence, I would say, there are extremely good examples of recovery preparedness plans among G20 countries, United States being one of them. Different states of Australia have very good recovery preparedness plans. In Indonesia, particularly in this region, its recovery is like almost like a well-oiled machinery, I would say. You know, they know what to do, how to do, who will do what, and may not be, fully efficient, but at least they know where to start. There is no time gap between, the time gap we are talking about, which can happen in several countries, as we see, as I was talking about Syria the other day. There is no institution to deal with recovery. And financing is not the biggest issue right now, because you don't have capacities within the country, even if you have that $1 billion made available to you to do recovery, right? So I think planning it ahead, as you plan for a marathon, is much more important. And preparedness for recovery, as we do preparedness for response, should be one of the key messages that most G20 countries who already have these systems working should be able to advocate for and promote. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rita. I think I'll stop there. Those words are enough to emphasize the point on it's building back better. Building back faster may be not realistic, so I appreciate that as well. I want to thank all of you for joining us. I want to thank all of you to spend your morning listening to us. I think hopefully we've given you enough food for thought as you go into the deliberations. I would take an opportunity to invite at least all of our panelists to the stage, SRSG as well. Let's take a quick group photograph and then we'll call it an end to this session.